And what do we see emerging this week? Do we see the shadow of China lifting from above the shades of India at least a little? The summit between leaders of the two countries appears to have been very promising. More on that from a leading expert in London in a very short while, and he's been watching that space very closely. But first, let's catch up on a dinner held again right here in London, a dinner that tells a story. Whether it's a happy one or not may depend on who's listening to what and where. A dinner to celebrate a remarkable path in London. Close to 800 Indian companies generated more than £47 billion last year, creating more than 100,000 jobs. The annual turnover of a few hundred Indian companies in Britain about equals the annual GDP of Punjab. Is this reason to celebrate the success of Indian companies breaking new barriers and finding success around the world? Or is there reason to worry about the flow of capital from India arising out of insufficient faith in the Indian economy? In London, certainly, they are celebrating this as success, as noted in a new report by the company Grant Thornton. London sees this as a win-win situation.
A lot of the Indian companies who come here have extensive business in India, and they've been investing in India, they create jobs in India, and then they expand because of the global markets. You know, in the globalized world, you look for opportunities. So in this day and age, it's always a two-way street. So for instance, the Tata Group, if I may mention, one of the biggest job creators in the UK, is also one of the biggest job creators in the private sector in India. So I think it's a win-win situation for both sides. I don't see it as an either-or situation.
Not a loss if some of the earnings were to go back to India.
It potentially does represent a loss, but I think at the same time, what it does allow is these Indian companies to be able to generate significant profits in the UK, which they can then repatriate back to India for further expansion in India. There is this issue about diversifying your risk between the domestic market and the export markets. But certainly there are some sectors of the Indian business industry where they're actually well positioned for export. So for example, pharmaceuticals, which is something which is required and demanded across the globe, not just in India. There is a huge market opportunity outside India which needs to be exploited by these Indian companies. So I think it's a balance of making sure that the risk and rewards are matched.
Some of the more successful companies were presented awards through the course of the evening.
Our bank is a wholly owned subsidiary by Union Bank of India, parent in India. And we are a very simple bank. We provide corporate banking and retail deposits for the local customers. And we are very compliant to the local regulations, and probably that really helps us to grow.
Some expected successes around the table and others that are now emerging.
And the two big trends that we're seeing are first of all sector diversity. So telecoms and technology are of course the strongest of the sectors, but we're seeing a surge of engineering and manufacturing companies, pharmaceutical companies, financial services industry, media and several others. And the other major trend that we're seeing is the dominance of London as a hub of attracting Indian investment in the UK.
Yes, but on the other hand, we have the Chief Minister of Punjab knocking on the doors of one company after another, asking them to come and invest in the state. And a lot of those companies can be seen not in Ludhiana, but here in London. And of course, we're not talking just about Punjab. We could be speaking of any state comparatively. We are speaking of India, really. And is this a win-win situation? The jury's out on that one. We could be looking at another side to this story not currently being told here in London. But there are no unmixed joys, are there? Certainly not even the summit between India and China, even though that took some very significant and promising steps forward. What might those be? Let's step across to the Royal United Services Institute and hear from them. Raffaello, we had two different statements from India and China after this meeting, and we see a difference in tone and emphasis, particularly on terrorism. And for India, of course, terrorism is proxy for Pakistan, and that's a real area of divergence. But within the divergence, any sign of any convergence at all between India and China?
I mean, I think that when we're looking at the question of terrorism with India and China, it is, of course, a very sensitive one. For India, a lot of terrorist problems emanate from its neighbour Pakistan. Pakistan is, of course, a very close ally of China's. And Pakistan's very sensitive to some of these accusations. So that remains a sort of enduring point of contention. I think it's interesting to note that they even have mentioned these publicly in their discussion. We've seen this in a number of statements recently by India and by India and China when they've sort of been doing events together.
Is that a step forward?
I think it is a step forward, and it builds on steps that we've seen previously. If we look after the BRICS summit last year, there was a statement quite specifically about certain groups that the Chinese state agreed with the Indians were of great concern. If we think about the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SCO sees terrorism as one of its essential organizing concerns. Both countries are now members of it, so of course it is a concern. I think it's a question of the tone and how you're going to deal with these problems. I think China's view remains that if you're going to deal with these problems, shouting about it publicly at each other and pointing fingers isn't really going to resolve it. So that will always remain a point of contention between the two. But I think the fact that they're talking about it, the fact that they're talking more generally, speaks to a willingness to start to try to see how we can find points of convergence.
Is there a real threat of Islamist terrorism in any region within China?
Within China, the biggest problem that Beijing sees is from Xinjiang separatists and Xinjiang Islamists, who often use the sort of violent Islamist terminology in their expression. We haven't seen an attack there in some time, but what we have seen is globally the phenomenon of Uyghur extremism rising up as a concern in other theatres, in Syria in particular, but also in Afghanistan. And that is of great concern to China, ultimately because it might come back and have an impact within China. Historically, it's worth pointing out that these networks have had a footprint in Pakistan, and it has been an issue between China and Pakistan as well.
So this does signal some determination on the part of China to contain terrorism arising out of Pakistan. Is that a clear signal here, or at least a suggestion of a signal?
No, I think what we should read it as, we should say that, you know, China is aware of the issues that exist with Pakistan.
With what view?
Well, it is concerned about security threats within Pakistan. I mean, China is doing this massive investment in Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which has lots of people, lots of interest flowing into that country. And there is, of course, a concern around their security. And in Pakistan, you know, there's international terrorists to worry about, but there's also lots of domestic groups that have sort of problems and issues. And so that's a genuine concern that sort of China has more broadly.
But there is a separation made often between terrorism that may threaten Pakistan itself and terrorism that's aimed at India. The second, of course, being quite all right from the Pakistani point of view, and who knows, by implication from the Chinese point of view, because there is a view, I don't know if this is excessive, that China is using Pakistan to needle India. Do you think there's something in this, or is this just too much suspicion?
I mean, I think that there are probably elements within hawkish states in all three countries who are seeing some of these conspiratorial narratives and maybe feeding them to some degree. I think the reality is, though, that you need to look at history and you need to look at previous events. So if we think back to the Mumbai attack of 2008, China played a very important role in shuttle diplomacy because it did not want to see that situation escalate beyond as far as it had gone. And that is a role that China's continued to say. China's quite openly said to Pakistan, it would be good if your relations with India were better. They can see that a more harmonious South Asian region is going to be to their benefit, and that will only function if India and Pakistan are able to get along. And they're very aware of this fact that these sorts of terrorist incidents don't help that. So I think there's a real awareness about that within Beijing. I think the question is, how does Beijing want to tell Pakistan to do this? And I think what they don't think is the answer is to shout about it publicly. They think talking about it behind the scenes, negotiating, doing deals to make sure that problems don't sort of escalate out is the way to handle it. And I certainly don't think that they would like to see a repetition of the incident that we saw in 2008 in Mumbai, for example.
We've had an announcement of a China and India joint project in Afghanistan. We don't know the details of that yet, but in itself, the thought is quite significant. How far do you think this can go, and what kind of a message is that putting out?
Look, I think this is a really fantastic opportunity because at my institute, Research Institute, RUSI, we've done a number of projects in the past looking at China and Indian potential cooperation in Afghanistan. And we always identified Afghanistan as an interesting area where you could see China and India really playing a positive cooperative role together to try to help to bring that country finally to some sort of peace and stability. And focusing on the economics was always the aspect that we noted was one that you could see a certain amount of convergence on. So I think there's a real positive potential opportunity here to do something together as two great Asian powers in their own neighborhood, which would set a trend which I think could really be a great stepping stone to build on.
So it's not all hostility, and a lot of prevailing view in India, the prevailing mood, the dominant mood in India is that, well, China is out to encircle India. They have a port now in Sri Lanka, and they want access to the seas through Pakistan, and of course the Pacific Sea islands. Now, where is this fear of China coming from?
I mean, I think there's an element of history playing into it. I think there's an element of border conflicts. And to be honest with you, if I'm an Indian geostrategist and I look at a map and I see these Chinese bases pretty much in every country, or Chinese investments, let's say, strategic important investments in all of these countries that surround me, I could understand the concerns around encirclement. I think there's an element also of insecurity, dare I say it, in terms of India seeing its relationship. The way that China often treats India is as a sort of poor little brother, you know, and I think that narrative does come across a lot sometimes, and I think that's been a problem with Beijing that's been taking place really over the past couple of years in particular. There's this sense of kind of, you know, very much looking down on India, not being too concerned about Indian concerns. I think what's quite significant about this visit between Xi and Modi, and about some of the other indicators we've seen and some of the comments that have come out from Wang Yi and other quite senior Chinese officials, is I would argue a recognition that maybe things have gotten a little too sharp, and maybe they needed to try to find ways of working in more of a cooperative way, because the reality is these are two Asian giants that share borders and neighborhoods together. And if they're really going to prosper, they're going to prosper together. And if they have tension and hostility between them, it will be very difficult. So I think there's been a more active effort from Beijing to try to fix what I think they'd let drift a little bit too much into the strategic confrontation space.
On the border, there has been some movement forward, and we've seen Indian and Chinese military personnel with their families at parties at several points along the border. Now, that has to be good news.
I think it's very positive that we've started to see some attempts to do this sort of human bridge building exercises in these sorts of border areas. I do wonder about whether this is going to be adequate enough to deal with these problems when they start to rise up, as they invariably will at some point during the year.
Past these parties, do you see Doklam flaring up again?
I think Doklam is very difficult because I think at this point everyone's kind of withdrawn back to their positions. There's a question, though, how much the strategic context has been changed by what happened in the past, and whether India is going to be able to feel like it can reassert itself in a way that will guarantee its interests as well and feel like it's on a par, rather than the moment where I'd argue it looks on paper like China has managed to establish a sort of stronger position there. But I think if India is able to build its one up, I think you could see a sort of sense of strategic parity return.
Finally, trade, Raffaello. India has spoken of the need for trade balancing out, and of course trade imbalances are what suit China. With the Chinese exports to India, I think last financial year 60 billion, Indian exports 10 billion. Now China thrives on this kind of thing, and not just with India. Do you see that increased trade as one way of settling some sort of a peace and calm between the two? It just makes more sense to have more money on both sides.
I mean, I think trade is one thing, and improving trade relations is, every country wants to do that because it's bringing more economy. But actually, I think it's probably investment that is really going to help change that kind of dynamic. I think it's been very interesting to see some of the Chinese companies that are increasingly looking to the Indian market as a real big opportunity. If you look at companies like Huawei or Xiaomi, they're really basing their kind of future growth in Asia on getting into the Indian market. They see real opportunities there. If you look at some of the investments that Ant Financial or Alibaba or Alipay or some of these other companies have done into India recently, these are quite substantial, and I think they reflect the fact that there is a real economic opportunity that these Chinese companies can see in India, and that I think is going to start to build a very interesting framework and sort of lattice work of economic relations, which will ultimately have an impact at a political level as well.
So that Chinese investment in India is more a safety factor for India than anything India can do at the border?
I would think in the longer term, yes, because fundamentally if your economies are so deeply intertwined in a way that you can both live with, and one has to be of course sensitive to national security concerns within this regard, in some ways that does create a kind of context, a commercial context, which makes it very appealing for both countries to try to make sure that the overarching relationship does stay on a positive trend, realizing that there are some difficult security issues which will occasionally flare up, but it gives you a better context to be able to manage these.
And in all this, in strategic terms, in economic terms, where is the US in all this between India, China and Pakistan?
I mean, I think
if only they knew under Trump.
I think that the US approach had been recently, we've seen a sharpening of relations between the US and China. The Trump administration has been very much driving this forwards. There's a willingness there's an eagerness to sort of see China again as an enemy and to have a sort of strategic confrontation with them. But on the other side, there was an attempt as part of that to build up the relationship with India. I think what's interesting in some ways is there was a desire to create this quad group of Japan, the United States, India, and Australia to try to create a sort of alternative grouping that could sort of counter Chinese influence in the region. What's interesting is China strengthening its relationship with India starts to unravel and undermine that. But, you know, I think the reality is that for a country like India, you know, the relationship with China is always going to be very important. And to some degree, I think the bigger question is the degree to which we are seeing the United States that is pulling back from its sort of international commitments and it's changing the context in which, frankly, the rest of the world is operating and developing relationships with each other.
So on balance, good for China, good for India, good maybe even for Pakistan. Thank you very much, Rafael, for talking to us.
Thank you.
And since then, we've had a Chinese minister tweeting that tariffs have been lifted for Indian drugs and pharmaceutical companies to come and sell in the Chinese market, to trade, to do business, to set up investments, and in so doing begin to rebalance that trade deficit somewhat. Another reassuring sign, even though the Chinese space is not the easiest to read. And on that, perhaps happy note, time for a very short break. Welcome back to the starry world of Bollywood. Akshay Kumar is not the starriest of the lot, is he? But perhaps he is the most endearing, and let's remind ourselves just why.
Joining me is Akshay Kumar. Akshay Kumar, first of all, welcome. And you know, it's a great day today. You are again endorsing another social cause. Tell us why you're here. What is this all about?
चलो आज मैं आपसे पूछता हूँ, आपको कितना पता है इसके बारे में?
So basically, this is to do with rural development and other segments under rural development.
And to bring the youth from the rural places, to get them out, get their ideas out, make them feel that they are the people who are actually the right, मतलब उनके जो ideas हैं, वो सबके सामने लेके आओ, इनाम दो और उनको सहायता दो और उनको बढ़ोतरी दो कि आप करें, क्योंकि हम चाहते हैं कि जो रूरल एरिया है, जो 70% हमारे देश के रूरल एरियाज़ हैं, वो आगे बढ़ें और हमारे देश की जो इकोनॉमी है वो आगे बढ़े. एंड लेट एग्रीकल्चर बी वन ऑफ द मेन source of income for everyone here.
Right. You know, it is said that India is changing, it's progressing. Do you see some sort of difference in the rural sector also? Do you think there is a significant development that we can be proud of?
There is a lot of improvement. हाल ही में मैंने 3-4 दिन पहले ही पढ़ रहा था. The electricity has come everywhere in every village. पढ़ ही रहा था. Toilets have been made. So many toilets have been made. अब कितने सारी जगहों पे मैं देखता हूँ, चाहे वो स्टेशंस पे हों, रेलवे स्टेशन पे हों, पैड्स के वो डिस्पेंसर लगाए जा रहे हैं और बहुत सारी, तो थिंग्स आर चेंजिंग स्लोली बट स्टेडीली बट श्योरली. एंड यस, हमें उस स्पीड को और बढ़ाना है. So that is the whole idea for this, something like this also, which is a New India Conclave, where we get the youth from rural areas and will come out and show what they can think of, because I think they are geniuses and their ideas are amazing, and to make them feel important, and they are important because वो हमारे इस देश की शान है.
True. You know, not only through your films, which are so important, significant, and they have such an impact, be it a Padman, be it a Toiletic Prem Katha, but also your initiatives and, you know, you giving support to campaigns like, say, a Swachh Bharat or something to do with road safety. Do you consider yourself as this crusader for social change?
No, I'm not doing it because I'm not any crusader. I'm doing it because if somebody comes to me and if I can give my name and if somebody can listen to me and follow it. Just now, that girl whom you just met, she said, Akshay, I've started following that 6:30 diet. True. If somebody can listen, what is wrong with it? Absolutely. I'm not doing it, मुझे कोई पैसे नहीं मिलते.
No.
Okay, मुझे वो तमगे नहीं चाहिए. मुझे पॉलिटिक्स में नहीं आना. मुझे ऐसा कुछ नहीं करना है. I'm not interested in all these things. I'm more interested if somebody comes to me and talks about, and I really feel that cause. I feel this cause. I love the fact that they are doing something like this. They are going to bring the underprivileged and make them feel privileged and make them privileged. So why shouldn't I do it?
Right. Recently, you also decided to, you agreed to lend your support to wildlife, welfare by issuing this uniform that you decided to auction. Tell us, things turned out into a total different thing. It sparked a controversy. Are you upset by it?
No, I'm not upset. I do good things with good mind and good mindset, and that's it. I don't care what anybody has to think. I have done this, and I have done it with good intentions. और जिसको समझ में आए ठीक है, नहीं आए राम राम.
Thank you so much for talking to us, Akshay. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
And there we leave it for now. See you next weekend, and in the UK and Europe, of course, on the new Sky Channel 520.